backyard pile. Brown materials, here's a great list of different things that you can think about. Corn stalks, obviously, you're going to have to shred. Eggshells, you're going to want to dry them and probably crunch them up really good. And they can be difficult in a backyard system, but they're okay. Don't be alarmed if you see them for a really long time, but eventually they will break down. And then tips for adding the materials. So in a backyard system, you're going to want the materials to be as small as possible. So do some of the work for nature, because again, you're just not getting those high temperatures. The ratio, the general rule of thumb is, 2 parts carbon to 1 part nitrogen. It'll depend on the environment of your pile, what works for you. But say you have a bin similar to the one in the photo. So that's my home, that's my bin. I take that black bin out, I dump it in my pile, and then I put 2 of those black bins of leaves on top of anything I put into the bin. So usually if you use the same vessel to dump the scraps, you can kind of use it as a measuring cup almost. But that's the ratio: more brown, more carbon than nitrogen, and make sure any fresh nitrogen materials are covered by the carbon materials. That'll help keep interested critters as well as odors away. I use broccoli stalks as an example because we eat a ridiculous amount of broccoli. It's like the only vegetable my kids will eat. So I'm forever chopping them up when I'm putting it in the backyard. Turn, baby, turn. So aeration. Compost piles need water and oxygen, and lots of it, to break down effectively. Wow, I'm having a lot of technical difficulties. So during the warmer temperatures, you can turn daily. So almost every time you put in new materials, mix it up. But like right now, when it's getting below freezing every night, any heat that you're generating in there, you're going to destroy by aerating. So you're not going to want to turn materials as much. And it's okay if they're not breaking down. Just make sure you're layering, make sure you're covering, and when the warmer weather arrives, it will start back up again. And then at the end of the process, there's a secondary process called curing. And that's really when you just take the compost out of the pile and let it sit. This allows the chemical reactions, they're still ceasing even once it's turned into that brown compost. So I compare it to kind of like aging wine or like moonshine. Like sometimes you need it to distill a little bit before you add it to the plants, because it could be just too intense. And I go into that a little bit more here. So on a commercial pile, so like at Linvilla, where we take all of our materials, compost after the active phase will sit for at least 6 months before it is screened and sold or applied back to the farm. For an at-home system, the best recommendation is around 6 to 12 months. That can be frustrating. So I should have added, another material or another thing you need to bring to the composting process is patience. It just takes time, but it's worth it because it'll ensure that you're not endangering plants when you're applying it. How and when to apply compost. Obviously, spring is, just everything when it comes to planting. And then in the fall is actually another great time to add to your lawn, to add back to your potted plants. Compost it's not like a fertilizer where it immediately kind of drops all the nutrients at once. It's more like a time release vitamin. So it will give the soil back those nutrients over time, which will help the plants thrive over the winter, which can, be hard on houseplants especially. What plants benefit most? All of them. So don't be shy with your compost. Use it everywhere. Use it on your lawns, flowering plants, food-bearing plants, even your trees. All plants can benefit from the nutrients that are in compost. And it really doesn't take much. It's not like you need to cover everything. You don't need to fill a pot with it. It's really just an inch. And that will give the plants the nutrients that they need. And then common pile ailments. So smell, usually because of high nitrogen content. Sometimes if it's too wet, like if it's poured, you'll get odors, but it's usually the nitrogen that sets off. So just throw more carbon in there, turn it, and you should be fine. I wouldn't add water if it already smells. I would add carbon. But then if it looks really dry in a day or two, maybe add in a little water. I would also stop adding materials for a little bit if it is smelling. It's not doing anything. Again, usually that's a water issue, and usually immediately you'll see action if the temperatures are right and the mix is right. Pile has a crazy amount of bugs. This is something that we hear, and it depends. I mean, worms are a part of the process. Grubs are probably fine. If you start to see flies, then you are going to want to cover it with dirt. Closed vessels, this is usually not an issue. And then also make sure you're not putting any meat, pet manure, things like that. And then corn cobs can be an issue. They also take a really long time to break down. So, it's up to you what you want to do with corn cobs when the summer comes, but they're tough in a backyard system. Never getting finished product out of the pile. This is something we hear a lot with tumblers. So I would just kind of, again, let the process go for a little bit and then open up your tumbler and you'll probably have some compost. When you're working with the system like what Haverford Township is offering, you should be able to just take the bottom layer out using like a spade and just scrape it out and then let it sit next to the pile for a little bit. If you are, curing and letting it stabilize, you can cover it at that time. It doesn't need, so you can cover it with a trash bag, a tarp, whatever you have handy. It doesn't need to be totally airtight, but you don't want it getting soaking wet, then it could just be a big pile of dirt for a while. And those are the four main things that people, I will say the first two are pretty much all we hear about. And then the never getting finished product out of the pile is pretty common too. The bugs thing is not all the time, but any bugs make people nervous. So summing it up, here's a little visual on what it would look like. So you see the bottom, you see the screen, then you add your brown materials, your greens, and just keep layering it like lasagna. So when I said earlier, it's similar to a landfill in that like this goes in, then this goes in, then that goes in, then rinse and repeat. And if you just keep layering it like that, you'll start to see it's awesome when you go and you open to put materials in and you realize it's dropped like 3 inches because it's happened. And that means that you have compost down at the bottom that you can scrape out and now just let sit next to your pile. So very thrilling a moment. And that's pretty much it for the presentation at this time. So I guess what we'll do now is I'll see if there's questions in the chat. And if someone wants me to head back to the list, so we can totally do that right now. Hold on one second. Here we go. Here we go. No problem. So, and this isn't an exhaustive list by any stretch. There are people who do not like to put citrus in their backyard composting pile. And there are some people who love citrus in their backyard composting pile. So as you start to get into composting more, you'll have to figure out both what works for your mix and, sometimes it depends on what you're going to use the compost for. There are ways to get it tested too if you want to see like its acidity levels and things like that. But traditionally, fruits and vegetables are good to go. I would not throw anything whole into the compost. Like say you have a rotten clementine that you found at the bottom of your kitchen, counter bowl, you're going to want to chop that up and cover it pretty good, because otherwise you may just unearth it again. Good thing is citrus doesn't tend to attract many pests or things of that nature. Sorry. You should. So the question is, I think everyone can see the chat, but when starting to compost, could I do it now or start in the spring? You can absolutely start now. Start whenever you want. The only thing is, don't be discouraged if it's not breaking down. It's just very cold out right now, so it's harder for a pile to heat up. But there's no reason to wait until spring. Might give you a good way to get your feet wet until spring comes. But everyone in this area kind of composts all year round, and it goes well. So that's a good question. But I always think now's the time to start composting. Don't wait, because I'm sure spring will be busy again, and then it passes. So what else? Any other questions? Well, then I guess I will. Oh, all right. Is a compost starter necessary? Oh, yes, Eileen, I will do that too. Yes, loose tea leaves are absolutely fine, and probably preferable, to be honest. Tea bags, you're going to want to make sure there's no staples in there, because that won't break down. Nope, nothing wrong with burying scraps in your garden. Just be careful what kind of scraps. Some plants love, direct coffee grounds, high acidity foods, and some don't. So it just probably depends. I don't know if you're located in Haverford Township, because I think that's not the way to compost there. But no, there's nothing wrong with doing that. And actually, that's, I think, traditionally how composting really is done, is just burying it in the ground. And yes, Haverford Township has a brush composting program. A lot of the townships around here do, which is great. But I would definitely recommend, when fall comes around again, if you are composting, don't put out all your bags of leaves. Hang on to a couple, because around probably in like 3 weeks is when everyone starts running out of leaves, and then brown material is basically not as readily available until September, October again. Shredding leaves. You don't need to shred the leaves to go into the pile, especially if they're, brown and crunchy. They'll break down pretty quickly, especially, once you're mixing and watering them and going through that process. You can shred them if you want. You can also, if you don't feel like raking this year, you can just run over your leaves with a lawnmower. That's actually pretty good for your lawn. So some people enjoy that. You can use shredded junk mail. Just make sure it's not glossy in any way. But yeah, that's shredded paper. That would be absolutely fine. Newspaper works spectacularly. And I've had really good success with that. Yes, ash from natural firewood. Yes, if you're going to add also, just sometimes be careful. Don't put too much ash in at once, because it can overwhelm the system. And never put charcoal ash in your compost pile. That cannot go. That cannot go commercial either. So Eileen mentioned I should share a little bit about Mother Compost. So we're a service where every other week we'll come and pick up a bucket. We take it to Linville Orchards, which has a commercial facility, and they turn it into compost. And then we return up to 60 pounds in the spring. So you can check out more about us at mothercompost.com. If you want to do worm composting, I just saw a question from Diane about worm composting. You can put worms into your compost in the backyard, but worms usually find the compost pile. I wouldn't worry about it. I mean, they exist in the soil. and they will climb right up once it's on the ground, and they can get through the mesh. So you usually don't need to add them to accelerate. If you want to do vermicomposting or worm composting, that would actually be something that you would do in your basement. That would not be outside. So that's sort of a different type of composting. It's really good for people who don't have land or space. So Diana, hopefully I answered that question for you. But vermicomposting, that's also an incredibly rich soil amendment, and a very, very cool process, but it's a little different than traditional backyard composting. All right. Well, I guess that's all the questions, but if anyone thinks of anything, Joy and Eileen have my contact information, and you have the Have Compost. I'll just go back quickly to that slide so that everyone makes sure that they have all that information right here. So I'm sure if you reach out to them and they need to get questions over to me, they certainly can. But I would encourage everyone to try composting. I think it's amazing, and it's very, very rewarding once you get going. And you may run into an issue here or there, but it's usually very solvable. And it seems like Haverford Township is prepared to support you guys in this effort. So, that's half the battle. So thanks, everyone. Have a great night. And I don't know if you want the mic back, Eileen, or?
Or
we're good.
I was trying to do that quick. Yeah, I think everything's good. Thank you, everyone. That was really interesting. I learned a ton. It's really cool getting your hands into that dirt. So thank you.
Thanks,
okay.
everyone.
Good night, everyone.
Good night.
Good night. Thank you.